Before there were roads, there were rivers, many of them now vanished beneath deserts, cities, and fields. Tonight, we'll drift along these hidden highways and see how dry riverbeds quietly shaped where people traveled, settled, and dreamed. Quick question to set the mood. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments so we can map our sleepy journey together. And here's the hook. By the end of this video, you'll be able to read a landscape in the dark, hearing the echoes of rivers that no longer flow. Before there were maps, there were paths written in water, and even when the water went quiet, the writing stayed legible to anyone patient enough to look. Imagine standing on a wide plain under a soft twilight sky, the air cooling, the earth releasing the day's heat in little exhalations of scent, dust, fennel, damp stone. Your eyes adjust, and what looked like a featureless field becomes a gentle crease in the land, a shallow, wandering line that gathers a little fog, carries a different shade of soil, hosts a ribbon of darker grass. That crease is a memory of flow, an old river that has retired from the surface but still calls to travelers like a low, steady note. People have always heard it. Hunters knew the migrating herds would pause along that line to nibble the greener shoots. Gatherers knew the roots in that band pulled up easier and tasted sweeter because the earth there held water longer. Parents knew that if they let their children run beside the sinuous dip, they would find a pocket of shade, a spring that still whispered through sand, or a place where the ground gave way to smoother walking. The vanished river is a teacher, and its lesson is simple. Even absence can guide you. If you tilt your imagination toward deep time, you can watch climates sway like curtains, bringing lush seasons and then years of hard light. Rivers would fatten, split, braid, and finally slip into the ground. People learned to follow that choreography. They migrated along channels not because maps told them to, but because body sense did. The air was cooler. The breeze followed the corridor. Birds traced the line at dawn and dusk, and the stars seemed to travel above it in kind agreement. Along such corridors, campsites recur for good reasons. Level benches where flood water once laid fine silt, patches of reeds that can be woven into mats, driftwood left by a storm 2 generations ago, a lens of groundwater that can be coaxed upward by digging a few thoughtful hands deep. Each of these signs gives confidence to keep moving, and so a human root grows exactly where the river once rolled. When the channel dries, the path remains like a footprint, baked into clay. Trade learned the same trick. Picture a caravan cresting a low rise and finding not a shining stream, but a valley with a thread of pale pebbles winding through it. The old riverbed. The stones are smooth like truths told over and over. Even without water, they mean easier footing than dune or thorn scrub. They mean you are less likely to get lost because the channel itself is a gentle boundary, a shallow wall that gathers you, nudges you along, makes your march feel held. Merchants, donkey bells quiet in the evening, prefer such lines because they ration effort across days. Fewer pointless climbs, fewer ankle-turning surprises, more predictable distances between shade, pasture, and rest. So a vanished river becomes a road without needing to be paved. Later, it may literally be paved. Much later, a highway department might follow the same line, thinking the alignment is a triumph of modern survey, when in fact the survey was done by water ages before. There is also the way memory pools where water once did. Stories cling to these corridors, and stories are migration routes of their own. A tale of an ancestor who dug a well with a deer antler will anchor a family to a bend in the dry channel. And future travelers hearing the tale will angle their path to pass that bend, in case the well still listens. Myths of serpents or river spirits keep people cautious but attentive. Respect means you notice where the ground turns damp after moonrise, where mist gathers first, where frogs can be heard even in a drought year. Rituals arise. The small left-behind bundle of grain, the whispered thanks into a hollow reed, the practice of stepping around what looks like just a darker patch of sand because someone once stepped there and didn't come back until morning. Migration is not only feet and miles, it is attention carried forward, the choreography of care passed down from those who read the landscape before you. Even when rivers vanish, their architecture stays. Beneath your souls, the earth holds a skeleton of channels, paleo channels, filled with sand and gravel that once rattled under current. Those deposits drain quicker after rain, so plants that fear wet feet cluster at the edges, and plants that love moisture tuck themselves in the lower seam. The ground feels springier there. Sometimes, walking in the dark, you can hear a difference. A hollow note when your heel hits the cobble seam, a muffled thud in the finer silt. A patient traveler learns this music and uses it like a blind person's cane, tapping the day forward with every step. On a larger scale, entire chains of towns mirrored these hidden lines. A church or shrine stands on a safe terrace just above the ghost channel. A market square spreads on the flat where floods once polished the earth. A ferry place becomes a bridge, becomes a border crossing, and yet the river itself is only present in the way the streets curve, the way fog chooses a neighborhood on autumn mornings, the way basements feel cool, even in heat waves. Animals make maps that people borrow. Hoofed paths converge where the old bed still holds a thread of moisture, and those paths, beaten smooth by generations of bodies, invite human feet. Birds stitch the air above the same seams, dipping low to snag insects that rise from damp ground. A watching child notes the pattern, pulls their family along the bird road. Even predators respect these lines, not for water alone, but for the way the terrain flows. A pursuit is easier when the land itself guides the chase. Pastoralists learn to surf the seasons along these corridors, up-channel when snowmelt trickles through the subsurface and grasses green sequentially, down-channel when heat pushes forage into pockets where roots can still drink. Migration here is not linear ambition, but circular listening, an agreement with a ghost current that says, "We will move as you once moved, softly, at the speed of replenishment." Technology changed the pace of movement, but not its underlying grammar. Wheels prefer gradients eased by ancient flow. Rails seek the gentle bends pressed into the land by water with time to think. And even airplanes, when they come down to earth, need runways that often lie in valleys chosen long ago by vanished rivers. Town planners can deny this for a while, drawing grids over swales, burying drains, insisting that water obey right angles. But the first heavy rain remembers the old path, and basements remember with it. Those who move through a landscape best are those who accept the elder intelligence of water and let their roots, their settlements, their dreams align with the quiet template it left behind. That acceptance guides migrants who carry little more than hope. It guides city builders who want streets that breathe. It guides anyone who looks at a satellite image and notices the faint green finger trailing across tan ground, and thinks, that is where we should go. The lesson is not romantic, it is practical. A vanished river offers stable footing where flood once sorted stones by size. It promises chance encounters with subsurface moisture, which means fewer desperate gambles on far-off mirages. It organizes visibility. The channel's gentle sides let you see further. Let sound travel a little differently. Let smoke from a cooking fire disperse in a way that won't draw unwanted attention. It offers materials too. Smooth pebbles for grinding grain, clay for sealing jars, reeds for baskets, willow for bow shafts. A family moving steadily along such a line is less likely to be surprised by weather or strangers because the corridor tells you what is coming a little sooner. A scent of algae from a downstream marsh, a rustle of migrating wings that suggests a lake ahead, a shift in wind that signals a pass opening to a broader valley. The corridor speaks in hints, and migration is the art of hearing hints before they harden into needs. Even in cities, the ghost of flow persists. We park cars on streets that feel oddly cool underfoot, because a buried stream trickles beneath. We notice a neighborhood where gardens thrive with less effort. The water table there sits closer to reach, fed by the old channel. We cross bridges that still arch nowhere because a river once flowed there, and the city kept the structure out of habit or history. Commuters follow these lines unconsciously. The bus line runs along the old valley because vehicles accelerate more easily there. Cyclists glide in the same groove because the wind breaks kindly. Dog walkers favor the shaded curve of a path that traces a stream culverted a century ago. Migration now is measured in schedules and steps, but the principle holds. We drift where water once did because the land invites it. If you're listening as you drift towards sleep, let the idea be simple. You already know how to read these things. The eye likes curves. The ear trusts the way sound travels in a shallow trough. The skin notices where cool air pools at dusk, and the nose finds the small sweetness of damp earth under the bigger smell of dust. Follow those cues, and you will find the old road, the one that water wrote patiently 1,000 seasons at a time, the one that turns a vast plain into a friendly sentence you can read even in the dark, guiding you onward with a promise that the next bend and the next will make sense to your feet. Picture the Sahara not as a single ocean of sand, but as a memory of rain. Close your eyes and let the map soften. Where dunes now curl like sleeping animals, see grass brushing your calves, see acacia shade moving across the ground like the hand of a clock. Hear frogs gossiping in the twilight. In that greener age, monsoon clouds climbed north each summer and spilled themselves across basins and plateaus, and the land wrote slow calligraphy with water. Rivers braided, pooled and lingered. Lakes spread wide as small seas, catching the sky and giving it back in chips of blue. The old channels that linger today as dry lines were then lively, stitched with papyrus, trailed by ibis, stamped with cattle prints that dried into a language people learned to read with their feet. Follow one such artery eastward, a ribbon once called the Yellow Nile by those who study the bones of water. It ran where maps now show emptiness, a long, shallow groove, gathering seasonal flow and delivering it to the Nile proper. People traveled along it because everything travels along a river. Herds found pasture on the banks first, then camps sprouted near bends, then paths tied bend to bend. When the rains loosened their grip, centuries later, the channel faded, but the route remained. You can still trace it in a satellite image by the color of the soil, a paler thread across darker ground. And on the surface, by the way, the horizon seems to nod when you walk along it, like the land agreeing you are on the right line. Migration loves such agreement. It shortens the conversation between here and there. Turn west and imagine the Taman Rasset, a grand river that once gathered waters from the Atlas and the Hoggar and slid to the Atlantic through a canyon now drowned offshore. Stand on a gravel plain under a sky rinsed clean by night. The air smells of iron and stone. The ground is firm, a wash of pebbles sorted to comfort by the hands of old floods. Even in today's dryness, the corridor feels safe. The wind is gentler in its embrace. Your stride lengthens because the land has been engineered by time to carry you. Nomads still sense these lines. They do not always speak of the Taman Rasset by name, but they inherit its geometry. Why a camp tucks here and not there? Why a trail lifts slightly and then settles? Why a dune line points like a fleet of arrows toward grass after rain? Under starlight, the mountains keep the secrets of water. In the Tibesti and the Hoggar and the Tassili Naja, snow is rare, but stone remembers, funneling every brief cloudburst down into ravines and out across the flats. These ravines, wadis, are the Sahara's veins, dry most days, fierce for a handful of hours when storms find them, and generous afterward for weeks because they hold moisture below the surface where roots can sip. Travelers learn the etiquette of wadis. Do not camp in the bed. Sleep on the shoulder where the flood once smoothed a bench. Dig where tamarisks grow heavy-headed. Their roots are letters that spell water. Walk at dawn when the air pools cool in the low ground. It is the desert's way of pointing you in the right direction. Even now, with tires and engines and map pins glowing on phones, the old etiquette works, and those who heed it move with less waste. Across central basins, ancient lakes are still visible as ghost shorelines, faint terraces that wrap the horizon like bracelets. Lake Mega Chad, once so broad that waves may have had moods, has retreated into a cluster of pools and reed mazes, but the old margins guide people all the same. A shoreline, even without water, is a promise. It offers level ground for walking, windbreaks where dunes have piled against old banks, and a marching order of salt pans and clay flats where food once grew in shallow water. Migration follows the circle because circles return gifts. Villages arrange themselves on these rings in a quiet mathematics. Space for goats, space for dates, space for stories to collect dust and then be dusted off again. Rock art still tells the weather. On sandstone walls, in the Tassili, cattle with round bellies move through grass that your eyes can feel. There are swimmers carved into stone where now only lizards swim, and long-horned herders whose hands are raised as if measuring a water level. These are not illustrations so much as instructions. They say, There was water here. There was enough for children to splash. The river stayed long enough to learn its moods. A traveler passing under those panels in the age of turning climate would take their meaning and carry it forward a day, and then another day, choosing routes that collect such clues like beads. When the sky tightened and the green season shortened, those who already walked the river roads simply lengthened the spaces between camps and learned new wells by the old logic. Wells themselves became the punctuation of migration. In the Fezzan, where the Garamantes tended dates and wheat in a precinct of sand, water ran underfoot in aquifers fed by rain that fell when the world had a different voice. They coaxed it to the surface through underground channels, fogaras cut with hands and patience, each slope measured to a kindness so the flow would not run away. Those channels are work songs carved into the ground, and the oases they fed are commas that let travelers breathe. You can arrive at such a place from 2 days away because the air tells you it's there. A faint sweetness on the wind, a hush where leaves slow the sand's whisper, a change in the color of the sky just above the horizon where humidity thickens the light. To migrate from Guelta to Guelta, from palm's shadow to palm's shadow, is to walk by these commas and feel a sentence assemble under your feet. Caravans made these arteries audible. Think of the soft clink of salt slabs from Tagaza, the creak of leather, the murmur of prayers pooling at dusk as camels kneel and sigh. The route is chosen not only for the shortest line, but for the line that keeps water and footing in dialogue. Between Bilma and Agadez, between Tuat and Timbuktu, the safest way was often the ancient way, because a paleo channel offers predictability in a land where surprise can be costly. Even the stars seem to approve, rising and setting along familiar bearings in valleys where horizons are clean. Guides carry in their heads the distances between shade and sip, marked by cairns and by stories, and they hand that map to the next generation in verses that rhyme the names of wells with the taste of their water. Animals walked these lines before and after people, and their migrating bodies keep the paths open. Addax and Dorcas once threaded the same shallow corridors, learning where grass is green earliest after a storm, where the subsurface lingers moist, where the wind lays a meal of blown seed in predictable drifts. Vultures and kites ride thermals above the dry rivers because the air lifts differently there, and their spiral casts a shadow that moves like a pointer along the old course. To follow such signs is not romance, but craft. If your day's water depends on a correct guess, you make fewer guesses when the land is already annotated. When the rains withdrew further, movement adjusted again. Families stretched their circuits along the Nile corridor, the great river that does not vanish but shifts tone with the year. opening floodplains to planting, then closing them to ripen and rest. Those who came in along the yellow Nile's faded route found room along the banks, and they wove their seasons between the big water's moods and the desert's long alleys. Villages faced the river to drink, and the desert to breathe, using wadis as side doors into the interior when trade, marriage, or weather asked for it. In this choreography, vanished rivers remained on the stage as faint chalk lines that help the dancers find their marks in the dark. There are clues for the night traveler, small as a pebble and wide as a sky. A single line of darker shrubs winding across a plain. A curve in the dune field where crests meet like hands, tracing the memory of a channel. A patch of ground that crusts differently underfoot, crunching softly where salts rose and dried when water lay shallow. A morning fog that chooses the same hollow again and again, as if it remembers being a river and cannot quite let go. Follow 3 or 4 such hints in sequence, and you find yourself in company, with footprints older than your lifetime, with wheel ruts half swallowed by time, with a scatter of broken pots where someone once boiled millet and humming patience. The corridor does not announce itself. It beckons with a librarian's finger and trusts your curiosity. Even modern cities at the Sahara's edge refuse to forget the older grammar. Streets find the easy grade of dry valleys. Airports align their runways along wind-tamed axes. New neighborhoods bloom where old channels touched groundwater close to the surface. In the first heavy rain, culverts roar and sidewalks momentarily become streams, tracing in silver the same meanders that rock art hands once knew. Engineers widen drains, lay concrete, draw lines as certain as rulers allow, and yet the next year's water picks out the ancient path again, a ghost insisting on its name. Migrants, some on foot, some pressed into trains of trucks, listen to the same insistence, choosing passages that give them shade by noon and a line of stars to follow after dusk. If sleep is coming, let it find you walking gently across that quiet floor of gravel and light, moving from bench to bench, where floods long ago paused to take a breath. Let your breath match theirs. Let the past lay its cool hand on your shoulder in the form of a breeze that knows exactly which way to travel. Imagine a thin thread stretched from oasis to oasis, from Guelta to Guelta, from rock art gallery to rock-shadowed spring, and your steps sewing along it without hurry. The Sahara is vast, but its old rivers make it legible, and legibility is a kindness. You do not need to see the water to be guided by it. You only need to notice where the land remembers drinking, and be willing to walk in the memory's gentle pull. Imagine the Arabian Peninsula not as a blank of heat, but as a hand open to the sky, its lines, the wadis, waiting for brief handwriting in rain. Most days they are quiet corridors, pale gravel streams walled by tawny banks, the bed pressed smooth by older floods that passed like conversations and moved on. Walk one at dawn and you'll feel the air settle cooler along the floor, a hush that keeps your breathing even. Acacia throws round shade like coinage. Gaff trees lean in with green that looks wise, and the ground underfoot is a mosaic of pebbles sorted by a patient physics. The name of the valley changes as you move. Hanifa by the city, Al-Rumah when it grows long enough to dream of the Gulf, Dawan where the cliffs glow honey yellow, Shab where the sea squeezes into the Hajar foothills. But the grammar holds. A wadi is a road that water made, and people learned to walk its rules. The first rule is respect for sail, the sudden flood. Cloud builds behind dark ridges, and then the valley that was a pathway becomes a river in minutes, brown, musical, full of sticks, the sound like a drum. The ground remembers how to play. Travelers carry stories of those who camped in the middle and woke to water pushing their bedding along like a raft. The story is a warning and also a choreography. Sleep on the shoulder where a bench shows the last high mark. Pick your fire pit in sand that holds its shape. Test the floor with a heel to know if it crusted after a long drink or merely looks confident. Even if rain never comes that night, the carefulness makes movement smooth, like placing your steps in footprints that were set for you by someone walking kindly. The second rule is to borrow the wadi's memory. Where tamarisk thickets thicken, dig, and the shovel will strike damp sand that smells like iron and shade. Where the bank scallops in a curve, you will often find a pool that lasted from the last storm, a mirror dull with silt but perfectly polite to thirsty mouths. Goats trail their own maps to these places, writing small dark lines on pale ground. And people read those lines the way they read the winter stars. Suhail, the bright star that Arabs greet in late summer, rises when the worst heat loosens. Its season pairs with wadis being generous just enough for travel between wells. Thuraya, the Pleiades, tells farmers when to watch the sky, and men with palms sticky from dates glance up, then down, then up again, measuring harvest and journey by two calendars that never entirely disagree. Across the Sarawat and Asir ranges, ridgelines comb moisture out of passing air and pour it into channels that step toward the Tihama plain like silver zippers. In good years, the terraces shine with spate irrigation, sail caught and spread by stone checks, the water held just long enough to teach millet and sorghum what they need to know. Families inherit not only fields, but rights to flood. the order in which plots drink, the minute a gate should be nudged open, the time it takes for flow to reach the fig roots. Such calendars are migration's quieter twin. Herders time their down-valley walks to the harvest festivals, and traders arrange their strings of camels to arrive when the valley has fed its people and is ready to feed strangers with news. Farther east, the Hajar Mountains grip the sky and squeeze it into emerald slices, wadis that run green for days after rain, then retreat underground and leave their beds glowing with polished limestone. Here, Aflaj snake invisibly beneath villages, Falaj channels that carry borrowed groundwater in measured incline from mother wells to date gardens, to washing places, to mosques where coolness pools under arches. A traveler entering one of these valleys at mid-morning hears water even when he cannot see it. The sound is as soft as cloth being folded. Children know which gaps in the wall offer a handful to the thirsty, and their hands are practiced at lifting the reed cover and lowering it again. The path through these wadis is a best-kept secret that everyone knows. Shade on the left before noon, on the right after, crossings at stones that wobble but never lie. A bend where swallows stitch the air low enough to graze your shoulder like a blessing. Turn south, and the land breathes mist in Dhofar when the Kharif arrives, a monsoon that paints the cliffs velvet and braids the wadis with ferns and frankincense ghosts. The same valleys that run powder dry most of the year fill with trickles steady enough to be named, their names tasted like small sweets on the tongue. The frankincense trees cling to slopes above, and for centuries people walked the wadis down to the coast and up to inland markets, sacks perfuming the march. The incense road is not a single line on a map, but a network of valley floors and low passes that know the timetable of fog and the rhythm of rockfall. Caravan bells sound softer in greenery. Even camels step differently when the ground remembers rain. In the peninsula's heart, where the empty quarter begins to blow its long sentences, wadis become ancient runways that never quite lift into air. Wadi al-Rumah is such a ghost river, stretching hundreds of kilometers, a relaxed arc that once reached to the Gulf as Al-Batin. Walk a few hours on its bed, and you will feel what engineers feel when they plot a rail line. Grade so gentle your breath forgets to complain. Vistas so steady you can ration hope across the horizon. Villages keep one foot in this old corridor, even if their other foot stands in new neighborhoods. Riyadh's backbone is Wadi Hanifa, a green stroke through beige gardens and reed beds and birds pausing mid-migration, as if surprised to find a script still legible under concrete. On quiet mornings, you can watch fog choose the wadi first, the city still asleep, while the valley writes its usual cursive in white. On the western side, wadis fall from the Hejaz toward the Red Sea and lay out the oldest of invitations, corridor after corridor, where people, goods, and prayers moved. Before there were milestones, there were rock inscriptions, Safaitic scratches, and elaborate Kufic Quranic verses etched at rest points on wadi walls, the sandstone varnish shining like old leather. A wayfarer scans these panels the way a sailor reads a lighthouse, not for entertainment alone, but for bearings, for the reassurance that others found shade here, water here, mercy here. The Hejaz Railway later threaded roughly along the same logic, iron borrowing an itinerary that 1,000 seasons of sail had already tested. Hadramaut is a book bound in mud brick and written in wadis so broad they feel like continents within a desert. Shibam stands like a bundle of spears where Wadi Hadramaut narrows, and the route through that valley has been an artery for people carrying letters, money, and the shapes of their names to ports and back. The flood arrives some years in a way that reaches the first floors and reminds everyone that the city's height is an agreement with water. We will use your floor only in the driest sentences. Farmers set their fields on the pale ground where last floods laid silt, and the pattern of farms and hamlets looks like a braid when seen from a hill. Green, pale, green, pale. Each strand a memory of flow. Bedouin knowledge threads everything like sinew. They know the taste of a well by the way the bucket rope takes weight. They name ridgelines by the shade they cast in a certain week. They can tell you whether a wadi is open or closed that season. Open, meaning the sand lies firm and the banks carry signs of recent small flows. Closed, meaning the bed has drifted soft and will swallow a hoof up to the knee. Their tents, set above the bed, but near enough to listen, face into winds that clear smoke and away from the cliff faces where owls nest and drop tiny empires of bone. At night, the conversation in a wadi is gentle. The clicking of beetles, a fox remarking on the hour, a camel complaining in a tone that sounds ancient as a bowl. Above, the sky keeps its ledger. A bright track of stars leads down valley, and when dawn drains them, the valley itself becomes the track again. Trade made music here that never entirely faded. Long before oil tankers traced new chords across seas, camel trains braided the peninsula's wadis into a net that held the Arabian and the wider world together. Salt from flats, coffee beans from high terraces, pearls from shallow banks, cloth and stories, and the idea that a person could be born in one wadi and live content in another. Caravanserai were the commas that let sentences breathe, courtyards with wells, walls thick enough to hush wind, rooms where a trader could fall asleep, to the murmur of languages she did not need to understand. The route is patient. Those who rush it only discover that the valley has many ways of asking you to pause. An obliging tea fire at a shepherd's camp, a flock of green bee-eaters hovering like punctuation over a puddle, the slackening of sun near afternoon that makes a traveler soften their stride. In the modern era, asphalt took the invitation and paved it. Highways often shadow the old beds, not because planners were nostalgic, but because water chose the best grades eons ago. Bridges hop the channels at places already narrowed by bedrock. Towns expand along terraces that flood rarely. And when a storm unrolls its scroll across the land, its ink is visible on traffic reports, closures and diversions that trace the very curves you'd see from a ridge after rain. Engineers respond with gabions and culverts, and the wadis respond by teaching new lessons. That a culvert angled wrong will invite the river in, that a line of reeds where there were none. Last year means the groundwater has been quietly rearranging its loyalties. Those who commute through such valleys learn to leave 5 minutes earlier on days when humidity feels like a hand on the back of your neck. Small clues help a traveler who wishes to move lightly. Follow the line where ants carry seeds downhill. They know the shortest slope. Step where the pebble size climbs a notch. That's where the last flood lost a little energy and set down its suitcase, which likely means a terrace ahead. Look for petrified wood tucked inside banks. It tells of old vegetations and sometimes of soils that hold a longer drink. When you find a scatter of flint flakes, pause. A long-vanished camp rested here, and the choice of this shade or that hearth may still be the right one. In wadis that cut through basalt, the black stones warm slow and cool slow, making fine sleeping benches in shoulder seasons. In wadis walled by sandstone, the rock surrenders heat fast and gives back a feline kind of comfort you can lean your spine against. There are wadis that finish their journey at the sea and write the last sentence on a beach. Wadi Tiwi and Wadi Shab, their clear pools stepping toward the Gulf of Oman, their palms reading the wind and nodding yes. There are wadis that end in sand, fading like a voice that becomes a hum, and others that pour themselves into cities without ceremony, turning to green belts that keep neighborhoods sane in summer. Some hold little secret gardens where water lingers all year in a crack shaded by fig and fern, and the sound there is a thread you can carry with you for an afternoon. A coolness you can tuck into pocket thought and take out when the sun leans close. Each valley has its own catalogue of sounds, its own cast of birds, its own tone of gravel underfoot, and moving from one to the next is not repetition, but a study in accents. If you are walking for the sake of walking, the wadi will reward you with ease. If you are migrating because you must, it will reward you with logic. It offers sequence, bend, bench, thicket, pool, terrace, bend. And in sequence there is mercy. The pastures that green first after rain are usually the low benches at the inside of curbs. The last to green are the fans where side wadis spread their gifts thinly. Dates ripen on the trees nearest the older flow lines a few days before they do uphill. That few days is sometimes the difference between hunger and sweetness. Wells taste different from one bend to the next, and the taste tells you the hidden geology. More limestone here, more basalt there, which in turn tells you how long the well will last this season. The wadi speaks a language of practical poetry, and those who listen move farther with less. Night in a wadi is a lesson in proportions. The sky is wider because the banks lower the horizon, and constellations rise like travelers stepping over a threshold. Owls bump the air with soft fists, and foxes leave calligraphy on the sand that you can learn to read in a few mornings. A breeze uses the corridor to go somewhere it needs to be, and your tent, pitched where the slope breaks the wind, sounds like a sail making up its mind. Somewhere upstream, a shepherd's radio murmurs a song that belonged to his grandmother, and downstream a convoy hums on the highway that pretends it is new. Between them, the valley keeps its counsel and its invitation, asking only that you place your feet where water once practiced, the art of going somewhere worth the trouble. Imagine a river that people remembered before they could measure it, a river spoken into presence each dawn by recitation, a river whose banks survive as words, place names, and the alignment of towns. Walk the northwestern plains with that in mind, and the ground begins to confess. The surface looks level, wheat and mustard laid like quilts, but there is a line that gathers mist earlier than the rest, a slightly paler braid of soil where the plough bites differently, a drift of dunes arrested mid-step, pointing as if following a teacher through the classroom. That braid is the ghost many call Saraswati, the phantom stream that once stitched together pastures, orchards, kilns, shrines, and caravan halts. It lingers as the Gaga Hakra in talk among farmers, as Sasuti in the mouths of old men who point with canes, as Hakra in stories from further west where the wind plays long notes across salt flats. Rivers are seldom single. They travel as families of channels and memories, and this family still sits down to dinner in the landscape. Begin near the Siwalik foothills, where the plains lean carefully away from the hills. In late winter, the air smells of wood smoke and jaggery, and a traveler with patience can see the land's subtle tilt. An ancient corridor cups rain toward a southwesterly path. Long ago, side rivers may have visited, great ones that now spend themselves elsewhere, leaving behind wider banks than a modest seasonal stream could justify. leaving terraces where villages perch like birds on fence posts. When storms still wore the monsoon like a heavier cloak, those banks hosted a broad, shallow current as hospitable as a courtyard. Cattle wandered down to drink, children learned to float on backs and stare at the clouds, and potters chose clay from bars laid down by years when the river felt generous. Along this gallery of settled water, people learn to live with both rhythm and surprise, laying out streets that met at right angles as if to balance the river's curves, firing bricks to steady their walls against damp, opening drains to let seasonal water pass without insult, and then go on to the next town. If you walk with the river's logic, you come upon old places that still know their own names when the wind says them. The ground remembers the feel of a fortified mound, the crunch of potsherds underfoot like thin shells, the hint of copper green where someone once hammered wire into ornaments. At one bend, archaeologists found a street wide enough for carts to pass without argument. At another, fire altars set on brick platforms look toward the sky as if still warm. Grain bins echo with a different emptiness. There are beads, agate warmed and turned to carnelian, faience in small blues that feel like vows, and weights that settle into the palm with an assurance that trade demands. The river made a road, and the road made a conversation, and the conversation thickened into towns. When the climate turned its shoulder and the monsoon stepped back a pace or two, the habit of moving along that road did not evaporate. It only changed tempo. Stand on a winter morning where the Paleo Channel crosses fields and watch the fog. It creeps like water, hugging the old bed, pooling where a bend once slowed the flow, slipping away from the higher banks where new houses sit with their feet dry. Follow that fog line a few hours, and farmers will point out wells that never fail in lean years, boreholes that taste sweeter, old tanks that fill first with the season's gift. A traveler watches for other signs too. Tamarind and peepal trees that choose the same curve. A temple raised on a knoll that floods never quite reached. A village aligned to face an emptiness, as if greeting a guest who has stepped out for a moment. Names pile up like prayer beads: Gaga, Saraswati, Chautang, Hakra, Nara, and each bears a syllable of the old current. The river's story includes a trick that water likes to play: capture and escape. Great tributaries that once courted this corridor may have shifted their affections, tugged by tilting earth and the slow insistence of sediment. A stream that fed the phantom turned east and married a new course. Another angled west to a different fate. What remained here was a thread that swelled with monsoon, then lay quiet to think. People adjusted. Fields crept closer to the reliable terrace wells, Cattle paths learned new loops. Potters dug their clay a little deeper. Bead makers tempered ambition with patience. When the flow thinned further, some towns tightened into hamlets. Some families shouldered their packs and trailed the old bed like a shadow to where a larger river, unvanished, still kept its appointments. Others stayed, becoming custodians of an emptier stage, keeping the props oiled. A stepwell here, a check dam there, a tank cleaned after summer so it could catch the first rain as if catching a dear friend. Stepwells feel like stairways into time. A carved mouth opens in the village lane, and steps lead you down into sudden quiet, the air cooler by several sighs. On the walls, stone remembers the hands that set it, masons who knew how to draw water upward by drawing people downward. Many of these wells measure their worth by the old river's nearness. Groundwater swells where the Paleo Channel passes underfoot, and the well's shadowed pool is a thumbprint confirming the channel's path. At the mouth of a larger valley, far to the southwest, a queen once commissioned a stair mine of water so beautiful that even drought could not make the place feel poor. The river above ground may have lost its habit, but below ground it keeps its duty, and the step well turns duty into grace. Keep walking with the phantom, and you enter a country of dunes that seem to have paused mid-dance. They arc in ranks that echo a vanished current, their leeward faces crisp as folded paper. Between their arms, tongues of hardpan or old clay shine when the light leans low, and salt glitters like old laughter on the flats. The map says desert, but the eye finds lanes, and the foot agrees. Caravans took these lanes when there was copper to carry, salt to haul, dates to swap for cloth. The corridor that water made now students the work of wind, and people borrow both teachers. You can still pick out wheel ruts where carts once did what camels later learned to do better, and you can still find a scatter of broken bangles at places where women waited for the sun to loosen its hold so the day's last miles would pass kindly. Where the river's old bed reaches the edge of a salt wilderness, it relaxes and fans out as if relieved of the burden of a single decision. In a good year, seasonal streams will streak the flats with silver that dries to white, and birds will arrive abruptly, their wings turning the air to a bright fabric. Fishermen, who know water even when it is fickle, set their nets in the brief channels as if texting an old friend. Are you awake? Traders watch the same arithmetic play out in the sky. A distant thunder can mean a thin ribbon of passage will be generous for a week, enough to float a shallow boat or at least to ease wheels. The sea hangs nearby, like a long-held thought, and on some days you can smell it as if a tide had walked inland to eavesdrop on the conversation. The river's other career is in memory. Hymns honor it as wisdom, as speech, as the thread that holds learning like beads. Pilgrims trace its rumored course, not to prove a map, but to practice attention, bathing where a tank takes the first light, circling a shrine that may once have greeted the dawn from a river terrace, letting syllables run like water over stones. Rituals are how a community keeps time with a vanished thing. Pouring a small stream from pot to palm is a way of saying, we remember your voice. We remember how to listen. The discipline has practical effects. Villages that honor water in their calendar often keep their tanks cleaner, their bones tighter, their disputes over irrigation shorter, and those habits spill into travel. A traveler is given a drink first, directions second, advice third, and only then asked his business. The craft traditions along the corridor carry the same river logic. Brick sizes harmonize across distances because builders learned the dimensions that dry and cure well beside a certain kind of silt. Bead recipes travel with the same stubborn fidelity. How long to heat the agate, how to quench it, how to polish it so it catches the eye of a buyer a horizon away. Bullock carts hum in a pitch that seems fixed by wheel diameter and road texture, and that pitch repeats from village to village along the pale channel, as if the whole corridor were a single instrument played by passing seasons. Markets still set up on the high side of the old bed where storms cannot surprise them, and the stalls arrange themselves into the river's memory of flow. Heavy goods upstream, quick bargains eddying near the bridge, gossip pooling where the tea is poured with a flourish. Birds keep another archive. In winter, flights of cranes, bar-headed geese, and ducks draw faint lines across the sky that echo the ground's ancient curves. They set down where farmers flood a field for a day, where a tank surface catches the sun at just the correct angle, where a temple pond shelters reeds that rustle with the same vowel the river once spoke. A patient walker can use the bird's decisions as a map, following them bend by bend, stopping when they stop, learning to recognize the calm they prefer. A calm that is really the landscape remembering how to hold water without showing it. Even in summer, when noon presses hard and the air shivers above the road, a sudden flicker of bee-eaters over a green ribbon tells you there is moisture underfoot. Their wings annotate the phantom's paragraph. Cities that grew far from the old bed still behave as if it were nearby. Engineers sight drains along gentle swales that only reveal themselves after a morning of rain. New neighborhoods include linear parks that feel suspiciously like respectful distances from something powerful. When a cloudburst tests the grid, the water picks out the ancient line with a child's certainty. And for an hour, the city remembers what the plain remembers, that movement is easiest where water practiced it first. Commuters discover that certain roads never quite flood and others always do, and their detours draw a ghost map you could overlay on satellite images of paleo channels and be right more often than wrong. If sleep is taking your hand, let it lead you along this corridor without haste. Imagine standing at dusk on the shoulder of a dry bend, the air smelling of crushed grain and warm dust, the horizon wide but softened by the day's last light. Somewhere a flute tries a patient scale. A pot cools on a threshold. A well rope creaks once, then settles. In the fields, the stubble holds a faint sheen. In the tank, a single ring widens where a frog surfaced to test the evening. The phantom stream is not a ghost that haunts. It is a teacher that lingers, a chalk line on the floor of the world that shows you how people moved when the wind, the rain, and the long arithmetic of soil taught the steps and how they go on moving, by wells and words, by beads and bricks, by fog and bird flight, along a river that still flows in the grammar of the land. Think of a river that behaves like a restless thought, changing its mind across centuries, leaving behind sentences half finished and margins crowded with notes. On the Les Plateau, hills the color of old tea crumble into dust fine as flour, and wind and rain carry that dust down in endless generosity. The water that gathers it becomes heavy with story, yellow with silt, and when it spreads onto the North China Plain, it does what a loaded mind does. It wanders, it splits, it forgets itself, and begins again. People learn to move with this mind. They build on the higher scribbles left by older floods, natural levees that read like the spines of sleeping dragons. Then watch as a new season drops a new layer of gold around their ankles. Villages climb by subtle steps, each generation raising thresholds and roadbeds, each migration a modest rehearsal of patience. Shift the granary, angle the footpath, follow the freshest line to the market where boats once tied up and now carts arrive with the same creaking optimism. In the west, where the Wei River spreads a gentler hand through the Guangzhong Plain, the water's grammar trained early settlers to stitch fields into the rhythm of rise and fall. Millet first, then wheat, then orchards bright with spring, all cupped by low terraces that keep the flood respectful. Canals thread out from the main course like careful annotations, old engineering that takes the river's temper seriously and gives it dignified ways to enter the room. Walk at daybreak along those banks and you can hear the calm arithmetic of sluice gates, wood sliding on wood, a sound as even as breathing. The great capitals that rose here, walls squared to the compass, gates facing the plains, did not forget the river's habits, streets wide enough to receive a procession or a torrent, markets set back on safer ground, granaries placed where wet seasons would fail to surprise them. When the big river in the northeast spoke in a louder voice, people here listened for the echo and adjusted their steps along roads that had learned courtesy from water. Farther downstream, the yellow river meets the flat world and loses certainty. The load it carries from the loess is so rich that it sets the silt down like a traveler setting down luggage too often. Beds rise, banks lift with each flood, until the river finds itself, walking on its own toes above the plain. Then a storm comes that speaks in capital letters. A dike yields like a single weak verb, and the river chooses a new page. Northward toward the Bohai some centuries, southward to mingle with the Huai in others. Dry channels lace the abandoned page, long pale curves holding reeds and winter ice, a ribbon of darker trees in summer where the groundwater lingers close. People use these as ready-made roads. In dry years, carts roll on the hard-packed floor, wheels humming, oxen grateful for straightness. In wet years, the abandoned bed is a safe place to walk, while the living river frets elsewhere. Hamlet by hamlet, families pull back to the older levee spine. Then later, when peace returns, they creep down again with bean rows and melons, letting the land's memory of last flood set the boundary of their bravery. Migration here is seldom dramatic. It is a quilt of small, sensible moves. A neighborhood shifts 2 ridges inland because the last spring flood laid down sand instead of silk. A kiln relocates to a cut bank where fresher clay shows its fine grain. A market turns 90 degrees because boats now arrive from a side channel that did not exist when the old Mert were boys. The road to a bride's village changes by a mile. The songs keep the same verses, but the lines about bridges edit themselves. Fishermen rewrite their calendars by the behavior of carp in backwaters that used to be midstream. Farmers retune their schedules to the different way fog sits in the hollows, arriving earlier along a new course, leaving later where the Paleo Channel holds cool air. In archives and in kitchens, the names of fords and ferries get crossed out, rewritten, crossed out again. The map is a palimpsest, and the footsteps are what keep it legible. The river's wandering leaves a necklace of towns on old strand lines. Many wear the same ornaments: a temple that faces the memory of water, a row of storehouses with doors tall enough for sacks and news, a tea shop pitched to catch the traveling wind. Between towns, you can follow a procession of wells dug into the underbody of ancient banks. Their ropes creak with a tired music. Their buckets rise silvered in morning light. In summer, a traveler judges distances by the taste of the water. More loess here, more limestone there, and learns the underground bends of a course nobody has seen for years. In winter, hoarfrost outlines meanders like careful brushwork across the stubble, and a person on foot can walk a day by simply keeping to the white. When wind gilds the fields with dust from far upriver, roofs and hats and eyelashes carry the same color, and the whole world seems briefly made of the river's afterthought. Southward, the Huai and its lakes have served as the patient middlemen of change, catching the yellow when it chose that way and redistributing its gifts, too much silt, too much ambition, into a chain of basins, reeds, and slow water. Boats move along these reservoirs of memory, as if performing a ritual that outlives the reason for it, punting by pale reeds, trading salt and grain, stopping at granaries that float as if built of clouds. In some years, the water draws back until fields step down into basins planted with a temporary confidence. In others, it swells gently and erases the field lines without malice. Families who have lived by this seesaw leave quietly for a cousin's village on higher ground when the lake speaks of a longer visit. When the shore returns to its slim self, they return with seedlings and a renewed belief that luck is just a tension with manners. To the east, the Mandwold River, the Grand Canal, threads its long thought through the country, borrowing low saddles from watersheds, slipping into the slots between natural basins, remembering the politeness of every wadi and paleo channel it ever crossed. Bargemen know the meeting places where canal and river speak, places that tighten migration into narrower gates, toll stations, market quays, hostels whose beams smell of soy and resin, courtyards where 100 accents shape a single evening's gossip. The canal is a patient tutor of movement. It refuses hurry and rewards those who learn its tempo. Porters carry that lesson onto land routes. Their loads sway like boats, and their feet find shadowed verges that echo the smooth cadence of water. Even when rail and road arrive, their lines bend toward the same gentle gradients that water found first, and stations and service towns pop up in the familiar intervals that the old boatmen would recognize with a nod. North of the Great Bend, where the river leans against the tableland before deciding what sort of delta it will wear this century, the landscape is stippled with oxbows, some bright with rice, some stiff with willows, some quiet as old coins in silt. Herds follow the grassier loops. In spring, school children cut across them in autumn, and cart trails opt for the crescent of firm ground between bank and back swamp. In the bare months, wind writes thin lines of dust along former bars, marking paths that exist only in certain lights. At dusk, smoke from cooking fires pools in the lower hollows as gently as evening water. A traveler who has never seen the river alive could still walk a week by reading these tonal shifts. Lighter soil here, darker there, a ribbon of taller sorghum showing where moisture lingers, a village gate offset at a peculiar angle that only makes sense if you imagine a wide, slow channel pausing right there 100 harvests ago. In the far northwest, beyond the easy swing of the yellow, other wandering waters sketch the Silk Road's footnotes across gravel and sand. Rivers tumble from the Kilian and Kunlun in brief fury, then relax into fans that spread like opened umbrellas, each rib an invitation to settle. Oases bloom at the toes of these fans. Zhangye's poplars gleam like coins. Dunhuang's groves hush the wind. And between them, dry tongues of stream bed harden into causeways. Caravans move by this punctuation: spring, well, shrine, market, spring again. If a fan shifts its tongue a few miles in a long year, the caravan route shifts with it, silk and stories following the new pale thread. To travel east or west along this corridor is to put your trust in water that appears only often enough to keep hope in good repair. You go by the green line through tan, by the cut of willows against sky, by the rumor that a certain monastery's kitchen smoke is visible 2 bends before you can taste its soup. Eastward toward the sea, deltas remember 100 fronts of water and wind. The yellow seaward mouth builds quick, sulks, leaps sideways, relaxes. Tide lines rephrase themselves. Reeds step forward and back, like dancers who have learned to watch the drummer's mood. Villages anchor to the oldest ground they can find, a sandbar from another century, a spit of shell and silt that sits just a palm higher, and build their lives in layers like keepsakes packed for travel. Tidal paths guide fishermen between mudflats that look solid until you listen to them. The safe route twists in a way that makes sense only if you picture yesterday's flood slumping under today's sun. Children learn the delta like a second alphabet, one used to address crabs and cranes. When they grow and leave, their feet still favor the old curves in city parks and station platforms, because a person's stride keeps the memory of the first places that taught it ease. To live with a river that wanders is to apprentice yourself to soft compulsions. Dike builders read the water's shoulders and learn where to give it a balcony, not a wall. Ferrymen fold and unfold their ramps according to the day's pitch, their boats angled into current with the patience of a calligrapher making the long horizontal stroke. Farmers write their crops in bands that match the flood's memory. Barley where it sulks, rice where it lingers, cotton where summer retreats late. Even the wind seems to prefer the old channels, finding less friction there. Smoke from kilns and kitchens writes low cursive along the fossil banks, and people read the script without noticing they are reading. When those people must move, because a flood crossed a threshold, because a levee broke with a note that sounded final. They do so along the already familiar corridors. The abandoned bed that offers straightness, the natural levee that offers safety, the canal towpath that offers company, the rail that mimics all three. Night makes the lessons gentler. Cicadas soften into background. Frogs print ellipses in puddles left by an afternoon storm, and the river's far voice becomes a big, slow drum. Somewhere on a higher bank, the white of a shrine's eaves holds the last light. Somewhere in a cutbank, swallows stitch silence. To silence with a few last quick threads before sleep. A long train hums on the alignment a Ming engineer might have guessed and a Tang ferryman would have approved. If you stand very still, you can feel the ground under your soles nudge you almost imperceptibly in the direction water prefers to go. It is the body's tenderness for gravity's old advice. Follow that nudge, and you will find a lane beaten smooth by many migrations, some measured in miles, some in habits, where the earth keeps offering the same kindness, a slightly easier step, a slightly cooler breath, a slightly clearer way forward, written by a river that is always drafting and always true. Begin with a word that repeats across languages like a refrain. Beck, burn, brook, born, brunn, brond, brunner, and let that repetition guide your steps across a continent that remembers water even when it hides it. Europe wears its pale rivers like seams under a coat, chalk combs that run dry most years but cradle a winterborn after a week of rain. Ancient meltwater valleys in the north that now hold fields, roads, and towns like beads on a string. Buried channels under capitals where street names whisper what the ground once did. Strand where the shore lay. Fleet Street over a river made into a pipe. Embankment where the bank had to be argued into staying put. Walk quietly, and the land will show you its old handwriting. Alders draw dark cursive along damp soils. Willow and poplar sketch loopy margins in breeze. Fog at dawn rehearses the meanders with a steady hand. A pilgrim or peddler or drover could cross a season of Europe by following those low, cool lines, stepping from ford to ford, from ferry to bridge, from green lane to green lane, never far from a channel that once held light and now holds direction. On the chalk of southern England, the hills are full of instructions. Dry valleys, combes run toward rivers that are not always visible, their floors a soft glide underfoot. In years of generous rain, the winterborns rise suddenly, small and bright, and villages that carry the name Born or Burn nod as if to say, "We knew you'd be back." Drove roads take advantage of these hollows, holloways worn deep by hooves and rain, cool and green even in a dry summer, their banks stitched with hazel and dog rose. The names of crossings remember their purpose. Oxford, where oxen crossed; Cambridge, where the wooden ark took scholars over to fields; Stanford's, where stone lay shallow and steady under bed. The old river Thames keeps company with ghosts, the Effra, the Tyburn, the Fleet, and the city above them bends to their memory. A cooler street here in heat, a curve where a straight line would flood, a park that lies long and narrow because a culvert beneath it asks for breath. Traders once rolled barrels along the Strand because boats nosed up to a beach there. Centuries later, commuters follow the same elastic edge without noticing why the evening breeze feels saltier. Cross the channel, and the same grammar continues with new accents. The Sens Islands taught Paris to cluster and lean. The little Bièvre once carried dye and song into the city and now hums beneath it, influencing which wine shops have the kind of basement you want to sit in on a hot day. Brussels smoothed a lid over the Seine and discovered that its boulevards still behave like rivers. Traffic flows the way water once did. Fog favors the old course, and certain bridge names hang in the air without bridges under them. In Antwerp and Ghent, the Ruyen, covered canals, keep the memory of tides in their brick ribs. The city breathes differently along their lines. The Low Countries lay the river story bare. Peat rivers that wandered like thoughts, coaxed into steadier moods by dikes. Turpin, house mounds raised of old flood, like quiet ships anchored inland. Polders whose ditches etch a music staff across the fields, each line a note in the score of drainage and return. A traveller can move from Friesland to Zeeland by following alders that mark wet margins, by reading the place names that end in Broek, Veen, Meer, Wiel, each a hint about how water likes to behave there. Eastward, the Rhine and Meuse and Scheldt braid and unbraid, then settle into deltas whose paleo channels are written into village plans. A church sits on a sandy ridge laid down by a long-vanished branch. A market square occupies the inside of an old bend. A ferry crossing becomes a bridge, becomes a tunnel, but the approach roads keep their curve as if bowing to a memory. The Moselle loops through vineyards perched on river terraces fossilized into sun traps. The vines tell you where old water once idled long enough to leave warmth. Prague knows its Vltava Islands in its bones. Fog gathers low in November and reminds a walker that the city's most trusted streets are actually decisions made by water. Vienna rested its palaces along the Vienne and Danube while teaching them manners, cutting new channels, straightening moods. But the cool wickets of air down certain alleys still show you the lines beneath. Munich, Zurich, Hamburg, Berlin, each has a companion river under the visible one, a history of side channels and marsh turned into quarter and boulevard. In Berlin, the Spree once loafed in marsh. Now museum islands show you where the loafing made room for stone, and the air over Montbijou feels slightly river-tilted even in a snow flurry. Glaciers taught the north a different script. When the ice pulled back, it left eskers, long, narrow ridges of sand and gravel, written like run-on sentences across Sweden and Finland. People adopted them as roads because they ride high and dry above bog and lake. Uppsalaåsen carries footsteps and thoughts with the ease of a well-made sentence. Subglacial tunnel valleys, broad, flat-bottomed lanes, became migration corridors for reindeer and then for goods, then for telephone lines and motorways that like easy grades. In Denmark and northern Germany, the Urströmtäler, the great meltwater valleys, lie so gentle that a bicyclist can cross counties in a day without ever meeting a real hill, travelling in the comfort of an old river's absent weight. In winter, hoarfrost outlines the low ground in feathered white. Small towns wake to see their streets lightly mapped by ice into the shapes of streams that left centuries ago, and the mailman unconsciously follows the pail. To the south, the karst speaks in riddles that wandering feet learn to enjoy. In Slovenia and Croatia, rivers disappear into swallow holes with a contented sound, travel under limestone, and reappear in poljes, broad basins that flood like mirrors in spring and lie like meadows in summer. Villages sit on the rims as if around a stage. The intermittent Lake Kirknicker rehearses absence and return. Herons adjust their flight plans, shepherds adjust theirs, and migration along the margins absorbs those lessons until they feel like instinct. Farther west in the Apennines, water divides its time between surface and secrecy. The Via Flaminia and her kin pick river terraces for their beds, and pack animals learn that the gentlest climb is where a stream chewed a notch and then retired. Rome itself lives with the Tiber's old mischief. Quays and embankments tamed the surface, but street corners still know when to smell of river, and the city's oldest shrines sit on tiny tongues of higher ground that a flood forgot to reach. Florence faces the Arno with a mixture of admiration and caution. Pisa's quiet lean toward the sea echoes a time when the river's mouth had other ideas and other rooms. East again, the Danube draws a continental sentence too long for one breath. It gathers tributaries that were once independent storytellers, the Morava, the Drava, the Tisa, and persuades them to harmonize. In the Pannonian Basin, the Tisa's former loops rest as crescents filled with reeds and fish. Hamlets stitch themselves along the outer banks of these ghost meanders because the soil there holds a drink longer. The word for wide valley is strath in one place, plain in another, alfold somewhere else, but the logic remains. Broad water once taught people to spread out their steps, to plant where silt lingered, to winter where fog kept frost from biting quite as hard. Downstream, the iron gates remind feet and keels that not every passage is easy, but behind the gorges the river relaxes again, laying out chessboards of islands and side channels where fishermen carry maps in their heads, drawn not with lines, but with smells and sounds. Sedge rubbing on current, the particular slap of a barge wake against clay. On the Iberian Peninsula, the Tagus and Ebro-shaped habit with long patience. The Meseta's old rivers cut wide, soft valleys where transhuman herders walked their flocks along Cañadas Reales, royal drove roads that are just another way of saying vanished river paths with legal backing. The Ebro's terraces step down like seats in a Roman theatre. Orchards applaud the river with blossom, then fruit, then pruned patience. Where a tributary grew tired and wandered off, a chain of towns remained to testify. Bridge here, market there, a hill crowned with a castle because an old meander offered a moat without argument. The Guadiana remembers its trick of sinking underground and returning. Old wells and mills mark the places where that trick leaves gifts. Along the Atlantic fringe, in Portugal and Galicia, rear coastlines, drowned river mouths, turn valleys into long fingers of sea. Fisherfolk pivot between tides and streams like dancers who know both tempos by heart. Names are shortcuts, and Europe strews them like breadcrumbs for the attentive. Aber and Inver tell you where a river marries the sea. Strath and Glen declare width and narrowness with clean honesty. Ford shows you where to cross. Witch and Wick remember salt and trade at watery margins. Marsh, Mere, Car, Fen, Owen, Ow, Österow, Arsi, all confess wetness in some dialect or another. Street names, Quai, Kai, Ufa, Riva, Moll, Mean Edge. A pilgrim on the Camino follows river logic, even when the map pretends the line is high. Monasteries sit near springs, and their guest houses make a grid of mercy, paced a day apart. Bridge chapels mark where the current slows long enough for prayer. Packhorse bridges double as ribs in the animal of travel, their backs polished by centuries of wool and wine. Holloways dip to touch water meadows, then rise like exhalations toward farms that have learned which bench of ground belongs to flood and which belongs to cradle. The old floodplains taught cities where to put their markets and how to lay their streets. Water meadows along the Severn and Avon fattened cattle and words. Fairs met where the grass forgave many feet. Across the Channel, fairs took the names of rivers as part of their own, because season and flow conspired to make a pause necessary and profitable. Guilds carved their arms on bridges as if pinning credentials to water's lapel. Mills settled like cats wherever a pale channel promised a year's worth of purr, and mill races cut precise lines that later roads adopted because the land had already negotiated the grade. When rail arrived, engineers half remembered the feel of pack trains and barges. They chose alignments along valley sides and natural levees, built stations on the safe terraces where markets had stood, and left the old river to whisper under timetables. The smallest signs still help a traveler who wants to move with the least fuss. A swath of taller nettles betrays a seep in an otherwise thirsty hillside. A line of elderberry blooms early in a hollow that keeps night air. In winter, blackbirds follow hedge bottoms that trace forgotten drains, and their quick, dark flicker shows you a path that resists mud. In summer, dragonflies patrol at a height that tells you how close the water table dozes under turf. Churchyards tend to lie where floods politely hesitate. Their yews drink continuity. Village greens are often no more than the highest dry within the memory of an old bend, and the cricket pitch keeps its level on a flood's gift of silt. Even where beavers return and redraw the small creeks into broader sentences, they are really just remembering the grammar for us, putting commas back into streams that had lost their breath. Night returns the continent to first principles. The air pools cool in the lowest ground. Mist rehearses the old channels without needing a map. A cyclist rolling home along a canal towpath feels the day ease because water keeps a steady pace. A lorry on a motorway that follows a Roman road that followed a river terrace hums with an ancient efficiency. A walker on a ridgeway can see the dark strips where meadows hold dew longer, and could, if needed, descend toward them and find a ford by listening for frogs. Across fields and cities alike, basements breathe differently where a paleo channel runs. Linen dries slower there. Mushrooms bloom braver there. Cats choose that floor in heat waves. The body notices what the mind forgets, the slight drop in temperature, the altered sound of a footfall on gravel sorted by floods, the way wind prefers to slip along a certain lane, and arranges its journey accordingly. In this way, without fuss or drama, Europe's hidden rivers keep guiding. Past hedgerows that double as contour lines, through quarters named for vanished quays, across chalk where winter remembers how to be water, along eskers that carry footsteps like old friends, always with the same promise that gentler grades, cooler breaths, and kinder distances wait where water once walked and still tells you how to follow. Imagine a continent that listens more than it speaks, where the ground carries a memory of rain across distances so wide you measure them with patience. Australia lays out its ancient flowways like faint chalk lines on a red board. Dry creeks that wake after brief storms and then sleep for months. Riverbeds braided into palimpsests of sand and gravel, clay pans glazed like pottery, and rock holes that hold the sky in small, stubborn circles. People learned the grammar of this quiet water long before maps, and they kept it safe inside songs. A song begins at a spring and walks to a ridge. The words are steps. The melody is a line on the land. The verses name the next water, the next shade, the next place your heels will thank you. Follow the song and the country opens. It does not open quickly. It opens the way a night opens, star by star, feature by feature, a sequence that feels inevitable once you know it. Start where the interior breathes rivers that forget themselves and reappear. Cooper Creek, the Diamantina, the Georgina, all wide, shallow thoughts that travel only when the sky says yes. In flood, they spread into a braided paradise called the Channel Country, pages and pages of shimmering ink. When the water withdraws, it leaves handwriting in pale sand, the curves of former channels laid out like staves of music. Travelers move along those staves. Stockmen learned it from people who learned it from people who learned it from ancestors who walked the songs. Ride the higher levees for firm ground. Drop to the channels when you need shade. Camp near the lignum where birds write their own maps. Listen for the frogs whose voices uncover moisture before your eyes do. The old stock routes, Birdsville Track, Strzelecki Track, keep close to the confidence of these ghost rivers. Waterhole to waterhole, mound spring to mound spring. A chain of commas that keeps the sentence of travel breathable. Mound springs are the continent's patient promises. Fed by the great artesian basin, an underground ocean retired from a younger world, they exhale light into dry country. Each spring is a small argument with drought, a lens of water circled by reeds, a cool breath that turns a scar of salt into a halo of green. Names collect around them like birds. Wabma Karabu, Coward, Blanchcup. Some are ancient names spoken with a careful respect. Some are fresh labels that feel like tags on old luggage. Routes converge because springs do what crossroads do. Focus attention, make trade talkative, invite elders to explain the etiquette of arrival. A spring has protocols. Approach with quiet, take what you need, and leave the pool to rest. Clean the track you made to it so the next traveler can read the land as clearly as you did. The Afghan cameleers understood that logic and folded their own lines into it. Reins loose, shadows long, bells soft, introducing a rhythm that later rails would borrow and formalize as the Gan, which still runs like a taut line between waters whose surfaces rarely meet. Granite and desert oak country teaches another kind of hydration, stored in stone, not soil. On spinifex plains where wind plays the same song for days, the eye learns to look for namas, rock holes that sip rain and hold it under lids of leaf and dust. The lesson is simple and stern. Carry the knowledge, not more water than you can lift. Know which rock cups last through dry heat. Know which one is taboo and for whom. Know how to leave the cover in a way that invites return. Far to the south and west, Noongar country sets this knowledge into a cycle of 6 seasons, each instructing movement and rest, burn and wait, fish here and travel there. Songlines guiding feet between granite domes and paper bark swamps, as precisely as a compass would if a compass could taste the air. In the arid center, Matu and Pitjanjatjara walk the stories called Chukurpa, and those stories hold directions with a precision cartographers admire. This sandhill carries a soaks. That claypan fires with brine if you taste it. This mulga grove shadows a seam where the subsurface holds like a fist. Songlines do not merely pass through water. They are water's biography sung forward. A verse might name a hill shaped by a being whose steps made a spring at its base. The next verse might cross a salt lake where a breeze combs the crust, sheening it like hair. A pause where the singer adjusts the pitch is also a pause where the walker checks the bank for fresh tracks, the crust for safe passage, the sky for whether the Milky Way's emu has turned to show that eggs, emu eggs in nests, fish eggs in flooded backwaters, are ready. The emu in the sky is not a scatter of stars, but the dark between them, a silhouette of presence in apparent absence, which is the same lesson the old rivers keep teaching. The guidance is often in the quiet part. On certain nights, that dark bird rises above a dry creek like a guide on a ridge. Walkers press on, then rest when the song says to, because walk and song and creek all agree. Eastward the country grows bony with ridgelines that feed short creeks after storm, then sigh back into eucalypt shadow. Paperbark and tea tree remember the shape of water even when it is hiding. Their leaves songwrite humidity into a key the body understands. There are billabongs that hold their breath through a string of summers, ringed by coolaba and red gums, whose trunks announce which bend is safest to sleep beside. Ochre pits sit near these waters, like banks beside a marketplace, feeding trade that moves along the same quiet corridors. Pigments for ceremony and paint, coolamons and spears, flint and shells walked inland from coasts, petery leaves from the desert, a communication carried by feet and memory that never needed a road wider than a person's shoulders until hooves and wheels insisted. Floodplains keep a choreography that never grows stale. When the monsoon lifts its hem across the top end, rivers sprawl like dancers who forget to stop, and stone fish traps appear to lend a hand. Arrangements set by forebears with an engineer's patience. When the water slackens, mullet flash in the shallows and egrets study the light, and people step into the pattern just as their grandparents did, harvesting with courtesy and laughter. Later, when the flow retreats into paper bark shade, the same networks turn into highways for the feet of those who carry stories between camps. Dry season riverbeds are cathedrals of coolness. You walk their aisles under birds that stitch shadows across sand. You pause where the last pools cluster like thought, and you learn to judge by smell alone whether the next reach hides a drinkable cup beneath the scum. A child taught that smell is a child who can walk far. There are deserts that pretend to be flat until dusk, when the old channels announce themselves with colder air and a different cricket. The western desert's swales are lines you feel on skin before you see with eyes. The swale carries a softer crunch, a promise that the dunes will be kinder if you thread them where water once excused itself from wind. Spinifex gives way to softer herbs in these swales after rain. A person on foot who angles for that green thread will find edible seeds sooner, and a rest spot where the breeze won't bully the fire. Fire itself is a travel companion here. Cool burns set in the right season reopen country, making passage simpler for feet and for kangaroo, and the knowledge of how far the fire will walk and when it will sit is folded into songs. The time, the journey to when new shoots will be sweetest. In the southeast, where basalt plains hold their breath in dark soil, some rivers have been shouldered aside by channels cut for irrigation and cities, but their ghosts remain in the behavior of fog and the way roads prefer to seek the lee of a rise before crossing a wide emptiness. The Wimmera's terminal lakes, salt bright in drought, lake blue in generosity, collect the last of old currents in shallow basins, guide birds and people along margins where salt bush thrives. Dry creeks there carry stories of gold too, the way small rushes pulsed along paleo channels, miners digging where water once kindly sorted the heavy from the light. Towns sit on the higher strand lines of vanished lakes, streets mirroring beach curves, and old hotels face the direction a ferry would have approached if this were still sea. Even when asphalt lays new logic, it often bows to the comfortable decisions water taught first. Gentler gradients, kinder corners, shade waiting at intervals that feel right because feet chose them before engines did. Trade across this continent always tied itself to dependable cups of water, and those cups wrote migration's ledger. From the Kimberley's Boab-signed galleries, pockets of paint and patience where artist and creek keep each other company, to the quartz-bright tracks leading toward the desert oaks of the Anangu lands, goods and news moved in pulses that matched rain's memory. Message sticks traveled faster when carried by someone whose mind housed the right verses. A man who knew 3 ways to the same spring was useful in a dry season. A woman whose basket wove the right kind of reed said more by walking it than by speaking. When steel arrived, it followed those same lines, first on hoof, then with camels, then on sleepers laid where surveyors found that rivers had already negotiated with the ground for an easy slope. Stations, sidings, and towns stacked themselves at the tempo of waterholes, and even the spots where corrugations rattle a vehicle into a higher kind of attention are often the same spots where floodwater taught the land to shrug. Reading the signs is an art that begins with noticing. A line of taller mulga signals a drainage seam. A sudden green oval inside red land promises a clay pan that will hold rain longer because its floor is honest with clay. Ant nests tipped in a consistent direction can betray where storm winds most often arrive, and therefore where water will lie to consider its options. Galas and corellas throw pink confetti above a patch that drinks. Their racket can turn a day's decision. Kites spiral where thermal lifts off a dark gravel bed. Follow the spiral, and you find a low valley that will be generous with coolness at night. A dead limb pointing like a finger over a dry creek. Often shades a scoop where water lingers, and if the scoop is bare of tracks, it may be deep and easy. If the banks are scribbled with prints, the pool is shallow and contested. None of this is mystical. It is kindness practiced until it works without thinking, like a good song humming you into a direction before you're aware you chose it. Night travel requires another library. The Southern Cross stands like a small door, and the pointers like a handle. You pull the door a little to the right, where the song says, "The next soak sits." You stop when the emu in the sky bends to drink, because that bend mirrors a cupped hollow in the land where water also chooses to pause. The breeze learns the dry creeks as if they were flutes. It plays cooler in their lines even on still evenings, and if you stand in one and close your eyes, you can hear a map as well as see it. A termite mound field booms softly under moonlight because heat escapes unevenly there. Step to the side and the ground sounds blank, which sometimes means you've left the swale and should drift back. Footsteps on gibber, those slick, varnished stones, speak in glass. The tone lowers where an old channel laid bigger cobbles and climbs again where finer gravel spread. You compose a route by ear, by skin, by the small satisfied sigh the body gives when it aligns with a line the land prefers. Along coasts, drowned valleys, Rias, write long fingers of salt into hill country, and behind them, old freshwater streams keep their own stubborn memory in reeds and paper bark corridors. Estuary fish move with the tide and fresh pulses, and people shadow that movement, shifting camps so that mornings begin with a throw of a net in precisely the depth that yesterday's song predicted. On the dry side of the great dividing range, waterholes leave stories in rock, petroglyphs and painting that say, "Here we waited, here we thanked, here we promised to carry the path with care." The route over the next spur does not ignore the creek. It uses the seam beside it, where soil holds a boot print cleanly, where leaves announce lizards and snakes with tiny edits in the general hush, where a log fallen across the bed in a friendly angle offers a seat that always seems to be exactly where you need it. Cities grew, but their bones remember. A green swale cuts through suburbs, and dog walkers choose it every evening because the air there forgives the day more readily. That swale is an old creek in culvert, occasionally writing itself in sudden rain as silver punctuation on asphalt. Urban songlines exist, tram routes and footpaths that trace the easiest grade between water and work, and they feel inevitable because water first argued them into being. In heat, birds concentrate along these invisible lines, and the human body follows, unconsciously rationing effort by seeking cooler breath. In flood, the forgotten channels reintroduce themselves with a confidence that feels paternal. You cannot ignore a father who has your address. The solution is not to conquer, but to remember. A park in a valley left open, a path that rises just enough, a bridge where a ford once minded the seasons. If sleep is drifting close, let it find you walking a shallow creek that gleams like old pewter under a sky powdered with stars. Spinifex whispers on the banks like pages turned in a slow book. Somewhere upstream, a frog tries a note that sounds like hope. Somewhere downstream, a nightjar stitches the darkness with its soft, repetitive thread. Your feet align with the country's long thought: ridge, swale, stone, shade, cup of water, story stone, cool sand, and the pace becomes the music the land prefers. The song you carry is not simply for singing. It is an instrument for finding what you need and for leaving enough for the next traveler. Ahead, there will be another bend, and around it a patch of taller trees or a scarp of granite, and under that granite, a bowl of sky you can drink, and then another line to follow, not drawn on any paper, but taught by a continent that remembers the exact shape of water passing and invites you to remember it too. Begin where stone remembers water so clearly that even in drought your feet can feel its handwriting. In the American Southwest, the land is stitched with arroyos, dry creeks that sleep most of the year and then wake to speak in brown thunder. Walk an arroyo at dawn, and it grants you the same kindness water does: an easy grade, shade pooled under cottonwoods, a breeze that knows the corridor by heart. Tinnitus, rock pockets, hold last month's storm in thumbnail mirrors. A ring of damp lichen tells you which will last longest. Sheep learn these lines, then herders, then wagons, then roads, and over it all, a sky wide enough to let travelers measure distance in the way the Milky Way lays itself down. On Bahadas, where mountain fans spread their gravel like aprons, old channels braid and unbraid. The firm tongues between them become lanes you can trust with tired ankles. For centuries, people who knew the desert's grammar, Hohokam coaxing water through hand-cut canals, Puebloan farmers reading washes and terraces, moved along those same corridors, village to village, waterhole to waterhole, leaving pottery crumbs where the land suggested a pause. Later, riders and freighters traced the washes too, stepping from seep to seep across Sonoran thorn and Chihuahuan grass, linking mission, mine, and market by the quiet geometry that storm water had already surveyed. Follow the river logic north, and you meet mesas where stairways notch the cliff at pour-offs, short stone ladders that say, "This is the place to climb when the water comes." You pass petroglyphs that listen to the same silence you do. Many sited bends or on terraces just above the level where a flash flood would erase unwary campfires. Across lava Malpais, tanks in basalt collect sky in secret. A traveler learns the sheen of water by peripheral vision, the way dragonflies patrol above it, even when it is no more than a dark thought in stone. Names remember water whether or not water is present. Las Tinajas, White Tank, Cienega, Ojo. Acequia ditches still pull a green ribbon through adobe towns along the Rio Grande, and the footpaths beside them, levees for little rivers, tie neighborhoods together in a rhythm of shade and running sound. The old Spanish Trail and the Santa Fe Trail read the same map in larger letters, courting the Virgin and the Arkansas, counting on fords that horses could love and benches where wagons would not. Argue with gravity, even where straight ceremonial roads cross the desert. Their junctions choose sensible places, a spring mouth, a basin edge, a pass that keeps your breath measured. Turn east, and the continent spreads a different lesson. How a great river writes many drafts. The Mississippi wanders like a slow mind, thinking in meanders. It drops its silts into crescents that harden into oxbows, then lifts its channel onto its own levees until it decides to leap. From the Missouri's brown ambition to the quiet, leaf-shaded bayous of the lower delta, dry meander scars guide movement long after the water has moved on. In winter, hoarfrost marks those scars in white script. A person on foot could walk a day by following frost alone. Towns sit on old point bars, like memory set on a shelf. Ferry landings become bridges, landings become highways, and the approach roads keep their curves as if paying respect to the bend that taught them. Bayou Teche traces a former river's path so faithfully that cypress knees and front stoops face a current that is now an echo. Flatboats became steamboats, became two-lane blacktop where mud once asked for patience. The Natchez Trace rides a long, dry spine between watersheds so travelers could avoid fords in flood. Still river logic, just inverted. Where to walk when water is everywhere. The prairie's knit movement to paleo channels you can read from the height of a saddle. The Platte splits and braids into sandbars that cranes understand, and emigrants did too. The Oregon and California trails followed its easy grammar, then chased the sweet water along granite, where wind has polished waymarks into a sweetness your palm can recognize. South Pass is kind, not because someone declared it so, but because a river asked the mountains for a favor long ago. Wagons felt the favor and said yes. Farther north, the Red River Valley and the bed of Old Lake Agassiz lies so level that a bicycle seems to glide on thought alone. Towns step across strand lines like beads on a low necklace, and in spring you can watch fog pick out every buried shore. Where glacial meltwater once thundered, the scablands of the Columbia retain a stubborn memory. Coulees and dry falls, channels wide as a city that fill only when rain and season conspire. Roads and rail lines slip into those trenches because the grades are right and the wind behaves. A traveler learns to love the way basalt cliffs keep time with the horizon. Water made nations of canoes. In the North Woods and Lake Country, portage trails stitch watersheds with practical grace. Carry at the short neck between two blue ellipses. Set your pack where the spruce throws its shade. Drink from the side that runs clearer. Birch bark boats and voyageurs wrote a tempo into the land that winter repeated with a different instrument. Frozen rivers and lakes turning into white highways, dogs and snowshoes in place of paddles. The same sequence of bends and narrows teaching shelter, risk, comfort. Cree, Ojibwe, Dene, and many others carried knowledge on these lines that outlasts tool and treaty. Where to beach in a sudden squall, which muskeg hums treachery under a thin, grassy smile. How the call of geese pins the direction of a far marsh. In Alaska and the Yukon, whole migrations rest on water's long spine. Salmon runs and boat wakes, sled runners following the river's curve in low light, ice thickest where the current slows, thinner where an unseen spring warms the undersurface like a small generosity. Farther south, water and stone share the job. In the basin of Mexico, lakes cupped by volcanoes taught cities how to behave. Causeways marching across shallows, Chinampa gardens riding the season like green rafts, markets set on firm island ground facing a ring of mountains that hold both storms and stories. the old shorelines still arch through neighborhoods. A street will inexplicably follow a curve that only becomes obvious when rain rehearses an earlier age. White roads, the Sakbeob, ran arrow-straight between centers in the Maya lowlands, but even they linked reliable water, cenotes that open into the limestone like blue eyes, aguadas that collect rain in forest clearings, river margins where cacao trees prefer to whisper. The Yucatan's caste is a polite magician. Water hides and appears, and travel learns the trick by heart, stepping from sinkhole to sinkhole by memory and moon. The Uzumacinta and Grijalva cut green canyons where paddlers and traders learn the tempo of back eddies. Steps carved into banks say this is where to lift the canoe and walk while the river thinks too hard. Across the isthmus, the old Camino Real chose valleys that are not the steepest and not the easiest, but the ones where water and footing agree. Mule bells still sound right in those shadowed places where humidity braids itself into leaf and stone. In the Caribbean, blue holes in limestone and river mouths, bright with mangroves, turn island chains into dot-to-dot routes. Fishermen and traders learned to time the tide and river pulse as if they were verses in the same song, and hurricanes taught which valleys should be entered only with humility. On the Pacific side of South America, desert learns to be generous in narrow strokes. The Atacama's quebradas are bold parentheses cut into copper and salt. Their floors hold the memory of long-ago storms in pebbled fans that make the only sensible roads between Sala and coast. Llamas and people walk by the same logic: shade, slope, water, repeat. Oases like San Pedro gather caravans. The way springs gather dragonflies. Salt caravans thread from one green punctuation to the next, each stop a market and a school in what to notice. Farther south and east, the Andes arrange valleys like chapters: Urubamba, Apurimac, Mantaro, each with terraces stepping down to rivers that talk all day. The great road system, Capac Nhan, keeps to contours that spare breath, rides spurs between rivers so that bridges cross at their narrowest ideas, and places tambos where a side creek offers sweet water before a high pass. Stone bridges and rope ones both choose the only reasonable throats. When the river is moody, people take the old traverse high on the valley side and let water argue it out below. In the Amazon, water is not a line, but a season. Whole forests breathe with flood, trunks standing in brown light, fish nosing among seeds and ankles. This flood plain, the Várzea, becomes road, market, and mirror in rotation. Canoes take the higher routes in wet months, slipping over what were paths. In low water, the same families walk along beaches that did not exist last week, looking for turtle nests and driftwood messages. Blackwater Igapo and whitewater Mainstem are different schools of movement. one slow and secretive, one wide and declarative, and people who belong to them switch languages easily, watching color and scent for cues. Terra firm ridges, dry ground set like islands within the wet, hold long paths between river bends, an inland corridor that every generation keeps in its feet, because sometimes the river gives too much or takes too much, and you need a way that depends on neither. Between desert coast and mountain snow, Peru's river valleys write slim green poems out toward the sea. Each valley, a thread of orchards, canals, and wind, offers the only reasonable crossing of a dry belt. Trails climb the valley side to catch afternoon shade and to keep above sudden, brown hands that rush seaward after a cloudburst in high country. Old aqueducts and wind-gathering spirals, puquios and intakes, mark a choreography of water coaxed, not forced, and paths keep respectful distance along those lines, because the ground that understands water also understands feet. Northward, in Colombia and Venezuela, llanos swell and drain with a predictability that moves cattle and people together. Dry season rivers narrow into string and become fords and then roads. Wet season rivers spread their elbows and canoes reclaim authority, skirting gallery forests whose dark green underlines the paragraph of current. Across the Rockies and Sierra Madre, passes that matter follow rivers upstream as far as they can. Then a short, honest lift delivers you to another river that escorts you down. Even where roads now drill tunnels and railroads helically woo altitude, the valley choices are old. Camp on the inside of the bend, where the cold air is gentler. Expect wind in the afternoons when the sun sends rivers of air downhill. Trust the bench where an older flood had laid silt and left a line of aspen that shimmers like a sign. In California, cities where the memory of vanished channels, in the behavior of fog and the unreason of certain streets. Where marshes once breathed, levees now do, and the roads atop them are still the easiest lines across flatland that floods would rather keep to itself. River mouths that shifted in winter storms taught missions and ranchos where to anchor their doors. El Camino Real inherits a coastal bias to valleys and fords that feels inevitable when you walk it with tired calves. What to notice if you are traveling gently is how the smallest signs keep the largest promises. Tree lines wander across prairie for no apparent reason until you realize they're spelling out a buried creek. Deer prints turn from random to insistent as they angle toward a low gap where a sandbar once offered a dry step and still offers an easier one. Soil changes dialect underfoot, looser where an old point bar rests, tighter where clay remembers a backwater, and your stride alters without conscious decision, saving strength for the miles that ask. Town names are footnotes: Forks, Oxbow, Cutbank, Dryden, Arroyo Grande, Bayou Blue, Portage, Grand Junction, Muleshoe, Cenote, Tambo, each a postcard from a water past. Bridges keep their names even when the river has slipped away, and the approach to a ghost crossing often remains the best way through a tangle of modern streets, because water once convinced the land to be sensible there. Night folds the Americas into rivers of air. Cold slides down valley floors and settles in the old channels. Mist rehearses meanders over soy and corn and cane. In desert, the low ground cools first and most. In forest, frogs annotate the map with pulses that thicken where moisture gathers. Trains run where barges once had opinions. Highways shadow levees. Footpaths slip into culverts as if into memory, and emerge as alleys with better breath. If you stand still, you can feel the continent's long advice through your shoes. Follow the easy grade. Climb where stone pinches water and therefore pinches wind. Rest where the old river left a bench. Trust the way birds arrange themselves at dawn. Above a bend you cannot yet see, and let the land's quiet handwriting carry you. Arroyo to Cienega, Portage to Oxbow, Quebrada to Oasis, Bayou to beach, along trails of water and stone that were walked, ridden, paddled, and sung long before any map pretended to discover them. Begin with the easiest clue: shape. A vanished river leaves a habit of curves behind, a soft S that repeats until your body recognizes it before your eyes do. In a field, that curve might be a slightly lower seam where the plow line turns reluctant, a ribbon of darker soil, a strip of grass that stays green a week longer in late summer. In a city, it can be a park that refuses to be rectangular, a bike path that bends with an old tenderness, a row of houses set at a polite angle to every other street, as if remembering the water's manners. Follow the curve, and other clues gather themselves. Willow and alder, reeds and sedges, plants that vote for wetness with their roots, dragonflies cruising as if there is something to patrol, a cooler breath out of nowhere as dusk lowers the day. Height is the next friend. A river, even when gone, arranges the ground into whispers of high and low. Put your hand on a natural levee, only a palm or two above the field, and you will feel firmness. Where floods once dropped their heavier gifts. Step off that slight ridge, and your heel sinks into finer, darker soil. This was Back Swamp, the easygoing water's resting place. In big floodplains, those levee spines run for miles, like long thoughts. Towns know to sit on them. Lanes like to follow them. Barns and silos collect along them the way driftwood once did. In small valleys, look for gentle benches cut into the slope. River terraces that step down like stadium seats. Each step is a pause in an older channel, and footpaths inevitably pick the same places for their own breathers. Color will speak if you let it. Sandier seams, pale, quick draining, generous to carrots, mark old point bars where the river once twirled lazily. Browner stripes rich with clay hold on to water and to your boots. These were the quiet eddies and backwaters. After a shower, these zones declare themselves. A darker green, a longer shine of wetness, a smell like pennies, and rain coming from a place where the rest of the ground only smells of grass. In drought, paradoxically, the same lines stay slightly livelier. Nettles taller, dock broader, a faint silver where sedges turn their blades to catch evening. Even dead leaves betray the difference. They mat thicker over damp seams and skitter away over dry, and the sound underfoot switches from muffled to papery as you cross the ghost. Air has its rituals, and rivers taught them. Cold air is heavier. It slides along the old beds at night, like water used to, pooling in hollows before dawn. On frosty mornings, hoarfrost outlines the meanders in a pale script you could trace with a finger. In summer, dew lingers the longest in the same handwriting. Fog rehearses the old course first, then the rest of the world, so if you rise early and watch where the mist collects, the river will write its name in slow, kind letters. Sound behaves too. A shout travels further along a swale than over a ridge, footsteps dull on silt and ring on gravel. And if you stand very still, you can hear the quiet hiss of insects thicken over the damp ground while the dry stays almost silent. Stones are truthful, especially small ones. A vanished river sorts them the way a librarian sorts books, by size, by weight, by the stories they can bear. Run your hand through a pale seam and feel rounded pebbles smoothed to friendliness. That is an old bar. Walk a few steps, and you may find angular shards that never knew tumbling. That is bank or hillside. In some places, cobbles line up in gentle ribs across the ground, the last chords of riffles frozen into land. Cows prefer to walk beside them. Tires hum differently over them, and children, without being told why, hop from rib to rib because it feels like the right game. Trees keep the minutes of water in their rings and their feet, and you can read their meeting notes without cutting them open. Willows lean into old channels. Alders dress the edges. Poplars mark high water with a barber's pole of flood silt at their ankles. In dry country, tamarisk and mesquite betray hidden moisture by gathering themselves into lazy lines you can see from a hill. In forests, a change of understory, rushes replacing bracken, meadowsweet stealing a strip from grass, a sudden chorus of frogs in a place that looks inexplicable on the map, means you're crossing a memory of flow. If mistletoe fattens only on one side of a hedgerow, it might be borrowing a better water table there. Names tell on the past with cheerful honesty. Any place called a ford once invited feet to pass. A burn, beck, brook, bourne, brunn, brund, a killdeer road, a kill. Anything will have had running water close by. A fleet was once navigable. A strand was once a shore. A marsh, mere, car, fen, slough, sluice, sloot, wadi, nulla, arroyo, quebrada. Every language offers a pocket dictionary of wetness that the land still obeys. Even in cities, the old river pops up in titles. Wharf Road, where there is nothing to tie up now. Bridge Street with no bridge. Mill Lane with only a memory of flower in the air. Insurance maps and flood marks carved into stone doorways are their own index. But if you're strolling, watch for the modest bronzes set into walls showing old river levels, and for railings that curve in a place that otherwise prefers straight lines. Architecture leans toward water even after water retires. Warehouses choose long, airy rooms where barges once nosed in. Pubs and inns cluster at curbs because traffic slowed there. A sudden run of houses with short stoops and damp basements usually means you've hit the old back swamp fringe. Bridges remain as fossils, arches spanning grass, culverts with no obvious purpose, parapets guarding a dip shallow enough to step across. Yet the roads that approach them are still the sanest way through a neighborhood. In old villages, a church or shrine often takes the highest blush of ground within the curve, a sign that flood came often enough to teach humility, but not often enough to frighten people away. Graveyards on tiny knolls inside a meander are quiet footnotes to that lesson. Animals annotate the map continuously. Swallows bank low where insects hatch over damp seams. Dragonflies patrol old pools long after they look empty. Herons, with their calm certainty, stand on the inside of bends that aren't water anymore, aiming their beaks at nothing visible and yet telling you everything. Deer paths converge where the ground holds moisture under grass. Foxes lay their faint, spicy lines along swales because scent travels better there. In hot weather, dogs choose the same low lanes on their own. At night, frog choruses will rise in crescents that exactly match a buried oxbow. Fireflies sow little constellations along the old bank. Mosquitoes concentrate where the soil remembers how to sweat. In fields, crops write their own paleography. Barley ripens unevenly across a ghost meander. The greener ribbon means roots found a hidden sip. Drought maps itself in yellowing arcs, while after heavy rain, the lushest stripes can betray under drains built into old channels. Aerial views make the pattern obvious, but you don't need a bird's vantage to see it. Stand at the gate and softly squint until texture takes over. The sinuous difference will step forward like a friend recognizing you across a room. In orchards and vineyards, Frost pockets show where not to plant too low. The vintner who walks his rows at dawn can tell you the curve of the ancient stream without unfolding a single map. Touch is an able guide. Underfoot, the ground tightens on clay and relaxes over sand. Your stride shortens on the one and lengthens on the other. A walking stick tells you the same story. It clicks on gravel, sinks on silt, thuds on levee, and if you're curious, you can draw a tiny cross-section of the river's memory with each step. Your skin will register the change before thought does. A chill winding across a meadow on a still night. A shy breeze in a city lane that keeps its own temperature. A rise of humidity where there is no reason except buried flow. In mountains, time keeps clean notes. Rivers carve V-shaped valleys. When a stream migrates or dwindles, the V remains as a staircase of little flats tucked in the bends, dry cascades stopped in mid-laughter. Up on plateaus, old spillways, broad saddles between basins feel like ramps under your boots. They are why roads and animals choose the same passes. On glacial ground, eskers, long gravel ridges laid by rivers that ran inside ice, carry footpaths and lanes like ready-made causeways. Follow one, and you will cross bog and lake as if walking a thought that prefers to stay coherent. In deserts, the clues get brighter by becoming subtler. A line of darker varnish on stones shows where water once paused. A fan of pebbles at the mouth of a side valley spreads like an opened hand and offers the only sensible course for wheels or hooves. Saltbush and tamarisk draw faint green calligraphy across flats. If you angle to intercept the script, you arrive at seeps that smell like iron and patience. After a storm, watch where the last damp holds in shade. Return a week later, and those places still breathe a little cooler, still attract birds that carry news with their wings. Technology can help, but your senses can do most of the work. Old maps, when overlaid in your imagination on the ground in front of you, reveal why a neighborhood ignores the grid. Satellite images show pale threads where you felt cool air half an hour ago. But walking, listening, smelling, touching will tell you the same things in kinder increments. Even in rain, your eyes can sort the behavior of puddles. Water runs quickest along the remembered channel. Pools where a backwater used to idle and recedes last from what was once a quiet bend. Follow the last glisten, and you are reading a palimpsest at ground level. The past and present sharing ink. Human habits are the most dependable compass of all. Playgrounds land in long green ovals because those were flood meadows. Markets occupy slightly higher rectangles because traders kept their ankles dry. Footpaths cut diagonals across squares to reach the lowest gate because the old bank bent there, and bodies still prefer the curve. Where two parishes meet in an odd wiggle, that wiggle is often a stream that went to ground. Where a property boundary makes no sense until you stand in a cool seam of air, you have found someone else's memory of a ford. Even utility lines betray the ghost. Storm drains align with swales. A line of manholes runs across a park like a dotted sentence. In a downpour, the grates roar first, where the river used to. And if you'd like one last gentle trick for sleepy eyes, wait for twilight. As light flattens, contrast simplifies, and the land's long handwriting grows easier to read. Walk slowly. Notice where gnats collect in little galaxies, where the smell of wet stone rises without rain, where a strand of spider silk trembles because air is pooling in a low place you cannot yet see. Keep a loose map in your pocket. Mind, curve, bench, greener stripe, cooler breath, rounded stones, frog noise, willow line, house names, bridge to nowhere, frost handwriting, fog rehearsals, dragonflies patrolling empty water, pavements that never quite dry. Piece by piece, the invisible river stands up gently and begins to travel with you, not as a ghost, but as a guide, showing you where the earth likes to move softly and where your own steps can borrow that softness for a while. Begin with a simple promise. The past is a rehearsal, and if you can hear it, tomorrow arrives with kinder steps. Vanished rivers are not just curiosities traced on old maps. They are tools for the century that is already warming its hands. Each dry channel is a memory of how water prefers to move, where it rests, where it argues, where it forgives. When the sky grows stranger, longer droughts, sharper storms, these memories become a manual. Read them, and you can place houses where flood only nods, plant orchards where roots sip without stealing, draw roads along levees that have been quietly auditioned by 1,000 years of flow. Ignore them, and you build on back swamps that pretend to be meadows in fair weather. But remember their work. The instant rain returns to full voice. Cities can soften by listening. A buried stream under a neighborhood will tell you where to cut a green seam for air and water to travel. A park along an old meander doubles as a flood field in a year that speaks in bold fonts. Bioswales follow the pale line of a culverted creek, and suddenly the street breathes after thunderstorms. Planting shade trees along a fossil channel drops the summer temperature by a handful of merciful degrees. Those trees drink from shallow groundwater that the old river still replenishes in quiet pulses. A walkway that arcs where the ancient bend did is not whimsy. It is an alignment of bodies with ease. Even basements become wiser when you know the ghost flows beneath them. Waterproofing where silt once idled. Sump pumps where the backwaters lingered. Storage lifted out of the zone that will test you every so often just to see if you remember. Farms can become calmer instruments. On sandier point bar soils, the crop that loves drainage goes first. On heavier oxbow clays, the one that forgives wet feet. Shelter belts align with ghost channels to slow wind and invite owls. And the owls reduce the need for bait that poisons more than it solves. Ponds dug along an old bench fill on their own in wet months, and then tick the drought along with a measured generosity. If they overflow, they spill into the pale channel where spills are expected. A farmer who reads frost pockets from vanished meanders can cite orchards on kinder terraces and save a decade of sad blossoms. In years when rain arrives in sudden hands, letting water spread over a harvested field that was once a floodplain is not failure. It is a favor returned to the land that grew your food. Groundwater is a library, and paleo channels are its open stacks. Sand and gravel ribbons laid by an ancient river carry water beneath our feet even when the surface looks indifferent. Towns that map these ribbons can drill fewer, smarter wells, rotate withdrawals so aquifers rest, and fence the recharge zones with meadows rather than asphalt. In drought, tapping a buried valley is like borrowing from a relative who managed their money well. In flood, protecting that valley from pollutants is like keeping the relative from bad advice. Pipes and pumps can be honest about their lineage. Draw gently where the old current ran strongest. Avoid excavating where the river used to drop the fines that clog. Leave enough flow underground to keep springs bright for those downstream who have fewer tools and a fairer claim. Wildlife hears the same manual and moves by it. Dry river corridors are perennial highways for mammals and birds, ribbons of shade and forage that cross landscapes otherwise reluctant to share. Stitching reserves along these lines turns isolated parks into a network that breathes. A hedgerow here, a riparian strip there, a culvert widened to let otter and fox pass without fear. Rewetting a ghost meander with seasonal water revives amphibian choruses that stitch together spring. Wet meadows absorb peak flows and give them back to streams in summer, the way a wise elder loans without making a show of it. Beavers, where invited, will redraw the small grammar of creeks into paragraphs that slow fire and store rain. Their dams echo the river's own patient engineering, teaching us to trade a little control for a lot of resilience. Migration of people will follow the same corridors, whether we plan for it or let it surprise us. When coastlines fidget and heat humbles crops, families will move along the gentle grades that water mapped towards cities and valleys that still hold a drink. We can prepare routes with shade, way stations, clinics, translation, and work. Or we can discover again that crowds find the wadi and the levee with or without our permission. and crowding is kinder with a hand extended. Legal frameworks can learn the old names. A floodplain declared a commons for overflow days. A channel given personhood, where that helps us remember it can be harmed and can be healed. A right of way that prioritizes feet and bicycles along a paleo channel because engines have other options and bodies often do not. There is humility in making space for water. Managed retreat sounds harsh until you stand in a place that has asked gently for centuries to be left alone in wet years. Buying out the lowest blocks, planting a wet meadow, building the new houses on the natural levee a few streets back. This is not defeat. It is choreography with a partner that has always led. In coasts with drowned valleys, allowing salt to wander up again through old creeks creates nurseries for fish and buffers for storms. A boardwalk gets built, a school of mullet appears where cars once parked, and a city's children learn a shore that will still be there in their 40s. Upstream, flood storage basins can sit precisely where the ancient river widened and slowed. On feast days, they're parks. On hard days, they're lungs. Technology behaves better when it works with memory. LiDAR uncovers channels beneath crops like writing under writing. Remote sensing watches dew and fog trace the lines for free. Crowdsourced photographs after storm become a living atlas of where water rehearses its part. But a pair of boots will do most of the job. Surveyors who walk the alignment at dawn, planners who carry field notebooks instead of only screens, engineers who ask elders where the creek ran in their childhood. A culvert's diameter chosen by a story of a single great flood sometimes protects more faithfully than a formula that never left the office. Conversing across knowledge systems is not garnish. It is the main course. Indigenous science, songlines, seasonal calendars, river etiquette has been tested more deeply than any dataset we can download. Putting it on the table with hydrology and finance does not romanticize. It improves the plan. Memory lives in law, and money too. Insurance that prices risk by the truth of the flood map, not the convenience of politics, nudges houses to higher benches. Zoning that respects the ghost channel turns speculative rectangles into sinuous parks that never need to apologize for saving a neighborhood. Grants that reward farmers for keeping paleo channel buffers green buy downstream peace without demanding upstream poverty. When budgets are thin, choose the multipliers, a path that is a levee, that is a wildlife corridor, that is a cooling strip, a schoolyard that becomes a temporary pond after cloudburst, and a science lesson every week. A commuter rail line placed on the valley side where a river terrace already argued the grade into kindness 2 millennia ago. Archaeology and ancestry will come along if invited. Digging into vanished rivers unearths bread ovens, bead kilns, fish traps, songs. Saving those finds is not a luxury. It is a way to braid pride into resilience. A neighborhood that can tell its water story is a neighborhood with volunteers the morning after a storm, with elders who bring maps and teenagers who bring coffee and brooms. Museums can hold the heavy things: stone, pottery, a silvered photograph of a ferry where asphalt now shines. But the light things must live outside. A plaque at a bend explaining why the park curves. A trail of bronze fish set into pavement where the culvert runs. A school play where the river is a character with a sense of humor and a long memory. Fire and water negotiate more quietly when the old channels are kept open. In hot, dry summers, riparian strips along ghost streams serve as breaks. Moisture lingers, crews can anchor a line, wildlife can find a last refuge. In wet years that arrive angry, those same strips are sponges and corridors, absorbing, then releasing without panic. Towns that stitch evacuation routes along these low, straight, familiar lines. Levees, abandoned beds turned boulevards. Practice leaving with dignity and returning with order. The drill need not frighten. It can be a festival that follows the curve of a river that is technically not there. Even in rooms and courtyards, the echo helps. Architects drawing a low building along a pale channel will give it a breezeway that matches the night wind. Plant courtyards where cold air can pool and be useful. Lift floors just enough that a once-in-40-year storm is an inconvenience rather than a grief. In heat, that shape drinks less electricity. In rain, it shrugs. A hospital sited on the natural levee rather than the back swamp serves through the very week when roads are briefly boats. A library on the bench above the old floodplain becomes a shelter that is a civic poem. The shape of a city's kindness can be read in how it attends to places water once loved. Education is an instrument we can tune easily. Let children trace the ghost rivers in their neighborhoods with chalk after an early fog. Let them plant sedges along a culvert's mouth. Let them interview a grandparent about the year the stairwell smelled of river. A class can carry tape measures into a park and find the terrace steps of a vanished meander. A teacher can hold up a loaf of bread and talk about sand and clay and salt as if a flood had baked it for them. Once learned, these ways of seeing do not go away. They accompany careers in carpentry, nursing, design, law. A nurse who recognizes a heat island and a cool corridor saves lives by sending a van along the ribbon where breath is easiest. A carpenter who curls a porch around a breeze lowers a neighbor's bills for a decade. And then there is the small private mercy of knowing how to walk. When the power flickers and the phone forgets, the body still remembers. Follow the cooler air at dusk. Keep to the long curve. Rest on the bench the river left. Cross where the willow line gaps. Leave the low pocket before dawn frost finds you. Vanished rivers teach a kind of confidence that is quiet rather than loud. It says, "We have done this before. We can do it again." The ground under us has practiced being helpful. Our job is to notice and cooperate. Tomorrow, whether hotter or wetter or both, prefers people who move with attention. So the echo for tomorrow is not an elegy. It is a set of choices that line up like stepping stones. Map the ghosts. Keep their corridors green and clear. Let floods spread where floods want to remember themselves. Tuck houses where water only visits in stories. Borrow the old grades for trains and bikes. Stock ponds where the bench wants a bowl. Pay elders to guide the walk. Plant trees whose roots can reach the quiet vein. Write laws that admit what rain has already written. And at the end of the day, open your window for a moment and listen for the cool thread of air that wanders the old channel, the same thread that once carried fireflies and canoe songs, and that still knows how to steer you gently toward a way of living that can last. Thank you for drifting with me along the world's hidden waterways. If this gentle journey helped you rest, tap like, subscribe, and ring the bells softly so you don't miss the next midnight wander. In the comments, tell me where in the world you're watching from, and if there's a vanished river, dry creek, or old canal near you that whispers its story. Until we meet again, breathe easy, follow the cool curve of the night, and let your dreams keep to the easy grade that water once wrote. Good night.